Welcome Life Science learners to another installment. I'm sure you guys are excited, and looking in front of me, you're probably thinking, well, what is this guy up to today? Well guys, we're focusing on a section called nutrition. And in our first segment, we're going to be focusing on dentition. And what does that mean? So I've got a variety of different organisms, from herbivores, carnivores to omnivores. And so we're going to look at dentition as a concept in nutrition. And we're going to look at how different organisms have different types of teeth and their arrangement for their specific mode of nutrition. It's important that before we get into the lesson that we overview the core concepts and we look at some important terminology. During the course of the lesson, we will also draw specific attention to some of these skulls and look at the dentition and how that arrangement of teeth is specific to their mode of nutrition. So, hope you guys are excited and looking forward to the interaction. Let's get straight into the lesson. So, as I mentioned, it's important that we look at the terms first, review some main concepts, and then overview the process of nutrition by looking at digestion. In this lesson, we look at nutrition in various different animals. We talk about herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, and their mode of nutrition and their adaptation for their specific diet. We're also going to talk about dentition and the adaptation for feeding. So, in terms of how are their teeth arranged or specialized for their mode of feeding? Right, so some important terms. We've got to look at the concept of what is nutrition and what does that mean in terms of accessing food for energy. We're also going to talk about some important processes in nutrition like digestion, the concept of what mastication is, and that refers to the chewing of food, and so we see that as an important adaptation based on the dental formula or the teeth that are present. We're going to have to compare autotrophs and heterotrophs in terms of individuals that are able to produce their energy and those that consume other organisms. And then we're going to compare herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores in terms of their mode of nutrition as well as their structural adaptation of the jaws and teeth for that mode of nutrition. We're going to spend some time looking at what dental formula is, and that essentially points to the specialization and the arrangement of teeth on the jaws. We're going to look at the different types of teeth in terms of the incisors, canines, your molars, and your premolars. And that's an overview of the important terms. So as I always mention, it's important that you make note of these terms because we will draw reference to these terms. And if you do understand these terms, it makes it easier to associate a concept when we refer to that term. Right. So fundamentally important is for us to understand what is nutrition. It's important that we know that every individual needs energy. So how do they acquire that energy? Right. So let's unpack that. So nutrition is the biochemical and physiological process by which an organism uses food to support its life. It includes ingestion, digestion, absorption, assimilation, and egestion. So those are the 5 processes that are associated with how individuals acquire their nutrition. So again, it's the ability to look at the biochemical reaction, so in terms of what happens with the enzymes and how they break down the food, the physiological, so the changes in the body in regards to what happens with that food in the body, and the processes involved in them. It's important that we also recognize that nutrition is a method of being able to access nutrients. So what are nutrients? Nutrients are those important compounds that we get from food. And these would include things that provide us with energy, that allows us to grow, to carry out metabolism, and as well as to repair. So we need these nutrients for growth, for energy, as well as repairing damaged tissue. There are different modes of nutrition, guys. We've spent some time previously looking at autotrophs, and these are individuals that produce food. We've also mentioned the concept of autotrophic nutrition in the past. What does that mean? Essentially, it points to certain organisms such as plants, algae, and some bacteria, like your cyanobacteria, those that are able to photosynthesize. They can make their own food through a process called photosynthesis. So their mode of nutrition is being able to access food from the sun by carrying out photosynthesis. Some photosynthetic organisms are shown in this figure. Here we've got plants, and we know that they are autotrophs. We also see some algae, and we see obviously some bacteria that have the ability to be able to photosynthesize. And so these organisms have a different mode of nutrition called an autotrophic mode, essentially being able to produce their own food. There are two important modes of nutrition with regards to how organisms access their food. So one is your autotrophic nutrition, which we've just looked at. So in this type, plants and other photosynthetic organisms prepare their own food, and that is how they get the energy in terms of from the sun using photosynthesis. The next mode is your heterotrophic nutrition. Guys, the word heterotrophic comes from heterotrophs. Okay, so animals cannot produce their own food, so we refer to them as heterotrophs. How do they get their food? So they obviously consume other producers. So instead, they get their food by consuming other organisms, which is why they are also called consumers, because they consume other organisms for their nutritional needs. They may consume autotrophs or other heterotrophs. Heterotrophs include all animals and fungi, as well as many single-cell organisms that are able to engulf and use other organisms for their energy requirements. So, as we unpack what nutrition is, it's important to recognize what are nutrients. Guys, we often speak about the organic compounds. We know that those are the basic requirements for the production of many complex organic compounds in the body. So we need nutrients for the production of organic compounds. We also need nutrients that are required in relatively small amounts. So we unpack nutrients into two groups: your macronutrients, and these are generally required in larger quantities. So in terms of your proteins, your carbohydrates, your fats and lipids. But we also have micronutrients, and these are required in relatively small amounts by the body and are essential. So if we talk of iodine, your phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, potassium, these are required in small amounts but are crucial for our metabolism. Okay, so why is nutrition important? Why is it important that we're able to access food? Again, guys, we know that nutrition helps in proper growth and the maintenance of cells. It provides energy to carry out the different life processes. So an individual that has a balanced nutritional meal or diet has enough of energy to carry out other metabolic processes. And that's essential to every organism being able to survive. So why is energy needed? It's needed to carry out important metabolic processes such as cellular respiration, growth, repair, and regeneration. Where does all that energy come from? It comes from the foods that we consume. And through the food chain, we know that energy is passed from one organism to the next. It's important that we pause at this moment and reflect on what we've just looked at. So we've looked at nutrition as a concept. We've looked at why nutrition is important. We know that there are two groups of organisms: those that produce their own food and those that consume other organisms. Let's have a little break, and when we get back, we will look at how individuals access food, and we will look at types of nutrition based on heterotrophs accessing their food. I know you guys are excited to look at these skulls. Let's have a little break, and we'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back, Life Science learners. I trust that you guys are now refreshed and excited about what we're going to do in our lesson today. A recap of what we're doing. We're looking at nutrition, and we're focusing on the dentition and the organization and arrangement of the teeth in the jaw structure. In our segment earlier on, we spoke about the modes of nutrition. Let's elaborate on that, and let's talk about how individuals access food. It's important that we then link that to how the structure of their jaws have been adapted for their specific mode of nutrition. So guys, have you ever wondered how simple organisms access food? We mentioned earlier on that every individual or every living organism needs to access food. Unfortunately, when we talk about a unicellular organism, does it have teeth? How does it access food? And those are important questions. So we do know that every organism, as part of its basic characteristic of living, is that it must be able to access food or energy. And so if we talk about simple organisms like amoebas or even some of your invertebrates, how do they access food? So when we look at an amoeba, we know that it is a unicellular organism and that it does not have a mouth. So how does it ingest food? Guys, so amoebas are quite unique in their ability to be able to adapt to their environment. They produce structures called pseudopodia, or false feet. And these structures essentially will engulf a foreign particle that they see as food. So these false feet grow towards a source of food, engulf that source of food, and then take that into its internal contents. Within the amoeba, that food particle then is enclosed in a food vacuole. That vacuole will then contain the food particle. As part of its mode of nutrition, remember that the amoeba is a unicellular organism. It does not have complex processes like a multicellular organism has. So it will rely on enzymes that are produced within the vacuole and within the amoeba. And those enzymes are released, and those enzymes help to break down the food particle, releasing the simple micromolecules that are needed. So we find that that process of digestion then occurs where it's chemically broken down using enzymes. The next process after that would be what happens. That food or those nutrients are assimilated, meaning they are taken and put into complex forms of molecules that the amoeba needs, either for regeneration, growth, and repair. And then finally, we see that the last process in nutrition is the egestion. And so the amoeba is able to release the waste products that are not needed. So guys, again, a simple organism that is unicellular is able to exhibit the 5 different processes that we know are crucial to the process of nutrition. So again, it's important that we do recognize that there are other organisms not as complex as these, but also follow the same basic 5 steps in nutrition. And that's essentially, again, a recap, being able to ingest the food, consume the food, take it in, not necessarily through a mouth. It can happen through an opening which we refer to as the anterior end. If you focus on organisms like an earthworm has also the ability to be able to ingest using its mouth at the proximal end, at the anterior end. It will then take in the food, again using enzymes, digest that. Once digestion occurs, it is able to absorb that into its very simple blood system and then transports that to the different parts where it is assimilated. Assimilated essentially means breaking things down and then taking them and using them to make what the body needs. So reprogramming it, making something that the body needs. So I'll give you an example. So when we consume your proteins, the proteins are broken down into the building blocks, which are amino acids. Those amino acids are absorbed and then are assimilated into muscle, again producing what the body needs. And then finally, the waste products are removed. And you do know that every organism, if it's being able to feed and consume, it must release the waste products, as we see. So that's essentially how a simple organism like an amoeba will carry out a basic function of nutrition. Right, so the methods of feeding in animals obtain foods in different ways. So now let's focus on how animals obtain food. There are some that are called filter feeders. These are individuals that obtain nutrients from particles suspended in water. These are generally used by fish. So you see your filter feeding your baleen whales, and they take in large amounts of water. And as the water passes through, it filters out lots of the nutrients, the plankton, the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, so microscopic life forms. And those are then taken into the digestive system, and then they go through the 5 essential processes of ingestion, digestion, chemical breakdown, assimilation, and then absorption. So we see that in different forms. So they are filter feeders. We also see detritus feeders, and these obtain nutrients from particles suspended in the soil. As I mentioned earlier on, earthworms use this mode of ingestion. So they feed on decomposing plant and animal material. And so they basically will take in leaves and decomposing matter, and they consume those, and they go through fundamentally those 5 processes and able to access energy that is needed. Another mode of feeding is called fluid feeding. Again, this refers to obtaining nutrients by consuming other organisms' fluids. We see this in honeybees, mosquitoes, and you know that what they do. These exhibit that mode of food intake. So essentially, the mouthparts of these individuals will contain a proboscis or straw-like structure that either pierces into the skin or into a part of a flower, for this example, and it's able to suck up the liquid parts. And so their mode of nutrition is slightly different because they feed on fluid or liquid parts. And hence these individuals have a different structure in terms of their mode of nutrition. We also know that they are bulk feeding. These obtain nutrients by eating a whole organism. And we know that this is typically seen in some pythons where they engulf larger prey, swallow them up, crush them up by twisting their bodies, and then the process of digestion, assimilation, and egestion occur. So we know that their jaw structure is slightly differently adapted to most of herbivores and carnivores. And that's an interesting example of being able to look at how different animals are adapted to accessing food. So bulk feeding is quite an interesting way of feeding. And then we also have suction feeding, and these are basically ingesting prey via the surrounding fluids. This mode of ingestion is usually exhibited by aquatic predators such as your bony fish. And these fish basically suck up the nutrients from the floors of the seabed, and in that they extract the nutrients. So that is the different modes of feeding based on how individuals are able to access different parts of the environment to get energy. Right. As part of understanding modes of nutrition, it's important to look at the flow of energy. What do I mean by that? We do know that we started off with our autotrophs that are able to photosynthesize and produce the energy. Those organisms that feed on our autotrophs become your primary consumers, and they have energy that they have been able to access from your producers. These in turn provide energy to the secondary consumers, which have a different mode of nutrition. And then we finally see your tertiary consumers, in this case your bulk feeders, that are able to ingest an entire organism and consume that to access energy. And we see that there's a constant flow of energy from one trophic level to the next. And that is essentially how energy is passed down. We also refer to saprotrophs. So if you recollect, we spoke of fungi and how these are an important part of the food chain. So these also access energy, but not necessarily consuming and engulfing food, but by producing enzymes that allow them to absorb the nutrients from the surface or the material that they grow on. So this is how energy is passed on, and it forms an important part of nutrition in terms of understanding the flow of energy in the food chain. So guys, let's have a quick overview of the 5 essential processes in nutrition. It's important that we understand that food has to first be ingested. We noted that in an amoeba, it uses pseudopodia or false feet to engulf the food. Many individuals that we will look at now use a mouth to be able to consume or access the food. The next process is digestion, and we will look at digestion in detail, but it essentially refers to the process of how that food is broken down, either mechanically by chewing or by enzymes in a chemical process. And then finally, when that food particles have been broken down into the smallest bits, it's absorbed into the body, into the bloodstream, and then it's transported to where this body might need that. When it gets to specific areas, it is assimilate. The word assimilate means to put together. And so when those nutrients are absorbed by cells, the cells will put together the building blocks based on what the organism needs or what the cell needs. And so the example would be taking the amino acids and making proteins, storing the excess glucose as starch in plants or glycogen in animals. And finally, with the ingestion of food, it means that there must be the release of the unwanted or the waste products, and that is egestion. So egestion would refer to the removal of the undigested parts or parts that are not needed once consumed. Right. So let's have a detailed look at what happens during digestion. Guys, during the mechanical digestion process, food is physically broken down into smaller fragments by the act of chewing, also churning in the stomach as well as in the small intestine. So the first process of digestion starts off with a mechanical process which we refer to as chewing. The term that I used earlier on was called mastication. And mastication again points to the ability to chew food, and that's essentially what we're going to look at in a bit. So as I mentioned, mastication is initially the process where food is broken down by chewing into smaller parts by the grinding action of the teeth. Okay? The tongue also pushes the food towards the back of the throat, where it travels down the esophagus as a ball called the bolus. So when we swallow food after it's chewed and it's mixed with saliva, it forms a little ball that moves down, and that ball is called the bolus. The epiglottis is the little flap that prevents the food from moving into the trachea, and that allows for food to just pass down the esophagus, preventing it from getting into the trachea. It's important that we look at the jaw shape and the dental formula. The dental formula is a system of summarizing the number of each type of tooth, namely the incisors, canines, your premolars and your molars in each half of the mouth. Dental formula vary between species and may even be different on the upper jaws and the lower jaws. When we look at this, we know that here we've got to draw a line through that, and we've got to look at the dental formula of the lower jaw in each half. And essentially, the dental formula points to the different types and the ratios of teeth on the jaw. In this case, we can see that there are 2 incisors, there is 1 canine, there are 2 premolars and 3 molars. And this points to the formula of teeth on the lower jaw. Well guys, that's a wrap for this segment. Let's have a little comfort break, and when you're back, we will look at further dentition and the adaptations of these structures. Welcome back, Life Science learners. Trust that you guys are excited for the next bit of our lesson. We've been talking about nutrition in different animals. In this segment, we're going to focus specifically on these individuals and look at their jaw structure. It's important that we recognize what the functions of different teeth are, and that we understand how their different modes of nutrition have allowed for individuals to have specialized dentition. Let's try and unpack that concept of understanding the functions of teeth before we look at these individuals. Right, so I mentioned that we know that there are different types of teeth, but these are obviously arranged differently in different individuals. As a recap, we mentioned that we talked about the dental formula and how these were classified according to their arrangement and their numbers. Let's look at the different types of teeth and their function. Guys, the first group of teeth or the sets of teeth that we look at are your incisors, and I've labeled that and colored that out in yellow. And so I'm going to draw back to the incisors when we look at this specific specimen. So we know that this is a rabbit. I know that it's probably quite small from where you are, but these have significantly large incisors. Unfortunately, this little guy had lost some of his incisors in the process of feeding, but you can clearly see very well defined incisors. And so these incisors are used specifically for, let's look at its function, guys. They are chisel shaped and they're used for biting and cutting off food. So we know that these incisors are specifically adapted so that the individual can bite and chew off food. Interesting. Let's look at the next set of teeth, your canines. Guys, when we look at canines, these are significantly well adapted in individuals that are carnivorous, meaning individuals that are able to feed off prey, where they have to catch their prey, hold and tear off parts of their body. So with me today, I've got the skull of a lion. And so let's look at the canines of these. Obviously, this lion lost some of its canines while we were preserving this, but they are significantly well-developed teeth, long, elongated, strong, so that they're able to dig into a prey, grasp the prey, tear off the meat. And so you find that these individuals have smaller incisors but well-developed canines. Let's look at another individual. So this is the lower jaw of a baboon. If you look closer, you can see a very distinct canine. And these canines, one, serve as a mechanism to be able to catch their prey. They're also an indication of strength and vigor. So often you find that males show dominance by exhibiting their jaw structure and by grinding their teeth. Again, a sign of strength and especially important for their mode of feeding. When we look at a gorilla skull, you can clearly see distinctly developed canines. And think about its mode of nutrition. Again, carnivore. It's able to use its large canines to pierce into its prey, rip, grab, and tear. So you find that there's interlocking canines between the upper jaw and the lower jaw that can grasp, can rip, and can tear their prey apart. And that's, again, the adaptations of the canines. So if we go back to the canines, it's for holding, tearing, and killing their prey. Again, your carnivores have well-developed canines. The next set of teeth we look at are your premolars. So these are the ones that are situated behind the canines but in front of your molars. So your premolars, again, let's look at them. They're generally flat and uneven. They're used for grinding and crushing food. And so guys, if you think about the functions of these are the teeth that are probably the best suited for organisms that chew and grind a lot. And so here we've got the lower jaw of a herbivore, and this is of a cow, and you can clearly see on this flattened teeth that are designed for extensive chewing. And so they chew lots of their food, and hence you see that the premolars as well as your molars are flattened and have an uneven surface, again, that allows for grinding and crushing of the food. We also see this in some of your smaller herbivores, and this is of a rabbit, and if you do look closer, you can see that their premolars and molars are flattened to allow for the extensive grinding of their food before it is swallowed. Okay. The next set of teeth are the molars, and we see them right here. So these are the larger developed teeth towards the back of the jaw. And if we look at this lower jaw of a baboon, you can see that these molars are situated towards the back, large, well developed for crushing and grinding. So these teeth are flat, uneven surfaces. They're used for grinding and crushing their food. And if you look at that in the larger predators, you can see that they've got large molars, again allowing them to grind and crush, especially the bone structure in their prey. We also see that some teeth are called your carinaceal teeth, and these are specialized molars and premolars with jagged triangular edges, and this is used for your cutting of the meat, and we see this significantly developed in your lions. So you can see that their teeth have this triangular structure which allows for the upper jaw and the lower jaw to interlock and the molars and premolars to crush their teeth. So you'll see that distinct triangular structure of them. And finally, we talk about your third molars, and this is often referred to as your wisdom teeth. And so we find that some of us at the age of about 16 and 17 start experiencing pain and discomfort. And these are generally the teeth that grow right at the back behind your molars. So the last of the teeth to appear are the third molars, which are also referred to as your wisdom. You are not going to grow until these are about 17 years. So they generally come out when you're around 17. A great number of us never will experience the discomfort of having these grow. It's often removed as they grow, they tend to impact these last molars, causing lots of discomfort. And so those are often removed, and the reason is because of the overcrowding of the teeth in the back of the jaw. So guys, as we wrap this up, we need to talk about the dental formula. As I mentioned earlier on, the dental formula is an expression of the number of teeth of each kind on one half of the upper jaw and the lower jaw. So here's an expression of a dental formula. It essentially shows an upper jaw and the lower jaw, and it represents the distribution of teeth from the left half or the right half to the back. So here we see the jaw, the lower jaw, and so the dental formula points to the distribution of teeth from the half moving back, and this again on the upper jaw from the middle to the opposite end going back. So here we notice that we see the evidence of 2 incisors followed by 1 canine, 2 premolars and 3 molars moving from the middle, if I were to illustrate that. So it's moving from that point to the back, and in this case the bottom lower jaw would be again, so that's the upper jaw, and the lower jaw would be moving towards that direction, where we see again 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars and 3 molars on the one lower side half. Teeth are an important part of dentition. It's important that we have an overview of the basic structure of the tooth. Why is that important? Teeth play a very important role in chewing, and if we don't understand that, it will be probably a shortfall on us in terms of explaining how dentition occurs. So let's have a very quick overview of the structure of the teeth. The basic structure of the teeth, a teeth consists of enamel, which makes it really tough and hard, dentine, cementum, and pulp tissue. So guys, it's not for exam purposes that you need to know this, but it's important that we recognize what is it that makes the teeth structurally well suited for their function. And so the enamel is a coat on the surface that actually solidifies the teeth and gives it that strength, so they're able to crush and grind bone. You've got dentine that maintains the teeth. You've got the cementum, which actually cements the teeth into the bed of the jaw. And you've got the pulp tissue, in which the root of the tooth is embedded and supplied with nerves and blood vessels. So the portion of the tooth exposed to the oral cavity is known as the dental crown. So what we look at when we look at the jaw is the dental crown. So here you're looking at the dental crown. We often hear of the term crowning when you go to a dentist, and that's essentially replacing the top of the tooth, and that points to the crown, which is the exposed part in the mouth. So this is what we're looking at here, is the dental crown. We also do know that deep into the jawbone is the part that is resting, so it's called the tooth root. And so if we do look at, I'm going to try and refer to this, and here you can clearly see this is the root of the tooth in the jawbone, and that points to how deep it is situated in the jaw structure. And so this allows for the teeth to be well embedded in the jaw. So here's an overview. We can see that you've got the root, which is situated in the bony jaw, and it has the upper bits, which is the tough part with the strong enamel, below which is the sensitive dentine, as well as the inner core, which is the pulp, which is richly supplied with blood vessels and nerves. The gum is the soft tissue that surrounds and maintains the teeth, and you've got the jawbone, which is made up of bone tissue. Deep into that we have the roots that basically embed the teeth into the bone, and that is richly supplied with nerves and blood vessels. And that's the basic anatomy of the structure of the tooth. So guys, we've looked at types of nutritions, we've looked at the jaw shape and the dental formula. We're now looking at the adaptations of the teeth for the different modes of nutrition. Let's have a little break, and when we get back, we will apply our understanding to looking at how these individuals have structurally adapted jaws for their mode of nutrition. See you in a bit. Welcome back, life science learners. In this segment, we're going to wrap up nutrition. As I mentioned earlier on, we need to look at the dentition of these individuals. I do have these models here, but I've also been able to illustrate those images on the board. So let's look at how these different individuals have adapted their mode of nutrition based on their jaw structure. Right, so let's look at the adaptations of herbivores. Herbivores generally use their incisors to cut the plant material, and often only found in the lower jaw. So if you look at this jaw, you can see well-developed incisors indicated in blue, and unfortunately the upper jaw do not have any incisors. They usually lack canines, and if they are present, they're significantly small or they're deeply embedded into the root. They use their molars and premolars to grind their food extensively. So you can see well-developed molars and premolars. Let's look at this lower jaw of a cow. You can clearly see significantly reduced canines. The incisors in this model has actually fallen off, but you can see the well-developed molars and premolars, which are shaped in a way to allow for extensive grinding of their plant diet. Let's look at the dental formula of a sheep. So you notice that again, the upper jaw is indicated here, and you've got the lower jaw in the bottom. So if we look at the dental formula, again, the indication of, again, we're starting from the middle, so the incisors would be 0, so there are no incisors on the upper jaw. There are no canines, but it has 3 molars and 3 premolars. Okay, when we look at the lower jaw, guys, we can see 4 well-developed incisors, no canines, 3 molars, and 3 premolars, or the other way around. So again, as you would note, that large gap indicating the absence. However, the jaw is also elongated, indicating the development of your premolars and molars. So that essentially points to the structural adaptation for its mode of nutrition. Why would they need extensive molars and premolars? That's for the grinding. The absence of the canines, again, these are individuals that are not predators. So they use their incisors to bite off and the molars and premolars to chew their food. Right. It's important that the dental formula of sheep is unpacked as follows. I did that earlier on. We must take note that there is a horny pad on the upper jaw. And often if you open the upper jaw of a herbivore, you'll find that it's got a flat, bony pad, and that again allows for the incisors to hold on to so that the pulling of that grass or plant material can happen. So there's a large gap or a diastema between the incisors and the premolars. So guys, if you talk about this large space, or this, when we look at the space between the teeth in the upper jaw of a gorilla, that space between the teeth is called the diastema. And often the diastema forms a mechanism to allow for the upper jaw and lower jaws to interlock. So again, you notice that the presence of the diastema, or space between the teeth, allow for the interlocking jaws to hold onto their prey or food so that biting and chewing can happen. Right, now let's unpack the structural adaptations of a jaw of a carnivore. As I mentioned, with us today, we've got the lion as well as we've got the gorilla jaws that we're going to look at. And I'm going to reference these as we get into this. So they have distinctly pointed incisors to slice and to shred their meat. So if you look at the incisors, chisel-shaped, pointed. And this again is important in biting off their meat. And we see these incisors quite pointed and sharp, kind of chisel-shaped. They have large and well-developed canines that are used for catching, holding, and tearing the meat. As you look at this, you can see the well-developed canines, and I'll illustrate that here. Large, pointed, and elongated teeth. Again, it's crucial that a predator is able to grab onto its prey, pierce the canines. The space between them allows for the upper jaw and the lower jaw to interlock, and that's the significance of the space between the teeth. And that then allows them to rip the meat. So the sharp molars and premolars are modified to form the carinacial teeth. As I mentioned earlier on, you can see that triangular shaped structure on these teeth that allow for the interlocking between the upper teeth and the lower teeth, between the molars and premolars. You can see they're triangular shaped, and that allows for the prey or the meat to be caught between and crushed. And so it's a well-structured jawline to allow for effective accessing of the nutrients from their food. Let's look at the dental formula. Again, we start with the upper jaw, and we're moving from the middle to the back, and that's of the lower jaw, essentially moving from the middle to the back. Just to give you context, again, it's that half on the upper jaw, and it's that half on the lower jaw. So we've got 3 incisors, large developed canine, 4 molars, premolars, and 3 molars. And so if you look at that, you can clearly see the developed canine there. You can see your 4 molars, premolars, and your 3 molars there. And so if we look at that, you can clearly see how these jaws are specifically well adapted for being able to bite, tear, and then using their premolars and molars to crush bone and meat into more soluble particles. Right, so the distinctive feature of the carnivore is its carinacial teeth, which I mentioned earlier on. The upper 4th molar and the lower 1st molars have sharp knife-like edges, which I pointed out earlier on. So they're quite pointed and knife-like edges. And these slide past each other, slicing the meat through flesh just as a pair of sharp scissors would do. And so they're basically there to cut through the meat and to cut that up into smaller bits as it's swallowed. Right, carnivores are predators, and they expend a lot of energy in hunting, and hence, in order for them to be able to access food, they must be able to feed off larger prey. Meat is low in carbohydrates but rich in other nutrients, such as amino acids and protein, and that is essentially important for the energy requirements. Meat is easier to digest than plant material, and you'll find that carnivores have a much shorter digestive system compared to carnivores, which have an elongated digestive system for a much longer process for digesting plant material and accessing the nutrients. We know that the size of an open jaw is fairly large. So if we were to compare how the jaw of a predator opens up, so they have the ability to be able to extend their jaw much larger, and that allows for them to be able to grab and grip onto their prey. And this ability allows for greater size of prey to be consumed. Okay. However, if we look at that compared to a herbivore, and I've got, as I mentioned here, I've got a little rabbit, and its jaw size does not necessarily open significantly wider. We also know that cows do not open their jaw wide. And if you think of a horse, it doesn't stretch open its mouth wide. And so that's quite a significant difference. So we talk about the teeth are modified for grasping, tearing, and chewing through meat. We also know that the canines are long and sharp. They're used for killing of the prey and tearing their meat. Right. Let's move on to the omnivores. And guys, the best example of omnivores are us humans. And so I've got a human skull here, which shows you a jawline that shows quite uniform teeth. And let's try and unpack that. So, omnivores have a digestive system that consumes both plant material and animal material. So, the ability to be able to consume plant and animal matter means that we've got to have teeth that allow us to be able to grind the plant material, bite off the plant material, but also grind and chew some of the protein that we get from animal matter. So, an example of the emperor tamarin, which is a type of primate, has the following dental formula. It has 2 incisors, 1 canine, 3 premolars, and 2 molars. And essentially, we find that it has a similar arrangement on the lower jaw. Humans also have a similar arrangement. Again, that is an adaptation for being able to bite and chew and grind their food quite well. Other monkeys and humans have the following dental formula. So we've got 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. Again, an adaptation to an omnivorous diet. Okay? We can compare that to many of the other primates, and you can clearly see the distinct formation of your canines, your incisors, and your molars and your premolars. Again, an adaptation to a diet of plant and animal matter. Finally, guys, as we wrap this up, it's important that we compare the jaw structure, not just in terms of the teeth, but also in terms of the length of the jaw. We notice that herbivores generally have an elongated jaw. We also mentioned that in terms of the ability to open their jaws, in terms of their width, it's significantly smaller. On the other extreme, we've got carnivores that have a shorter, lower jaw line, distinct, what I refer to as zygomatic arches, which are there for the adaptation and attachment of strong muscles to allow for the jaw to open wider and to grab and hold. We notice that the jawline is much reduced and shorter in comparison to a herbivore, with larger canines distinctly present to be able to grab on. And right in the middle, we compare that to the omnivore, which has a blend between the two. So it's got generally well-developed incisors, subtle canines, which you see there. We don't use our canines significantly as other predators would use them. And we've got well-developed molars and premolars for chewing our food. So guys, as we wrap this segment up, it's important that you are able to access questions and where you're comparing the jaw structure. Note the key to be able to identify the type of habit, the type of feeding is by looking at the canines. We also spend a lot of time looking at the structure of teeth in terms of unpacking the mode of nutrition of some of our fossils that have been found. And so the dental formula and the arrangement of teeth often give us a lot of information around the feeding of some of the prehistoric individuals or fossils that we found. So jaw structure is important in terms of understanding the nutrition. So guys, I hope that you've enjoyed the engagement. Trust that you go back, reflect on what we've done, and then use this information to be able to access and answer some revision questions. Guys, from my side, trust that you've had a good day. Take care. See you soon. Have a bio-lekker day.